He utterly hated Jerry Seinfeld. Now we finally know why. For 3 decades, Johnny Carson reigned as the undisputed king of late-night television, a man whose sly smile and sharp wit could make or break the career of a young comedian. Robin Williams, Joan Rivers, David Letterman. Carson's nod of approval turned unknowns into household names overnight. He wasn't just a host. He was the gatekeeper of American comedy, the man whose blessing meant legitimacy in an industry that thrived on appearances. And yet, in the glittering constellation of comedians who rose under his watchful eye, there was one glaring omission: Jerry Seinfeld. By the 1990s, Seinfeld was America's biggest comedic export, a sitcom titan who turned observational jokes about nothing into cultural phenomena. His show dominated Thursday nights. His catchphrases became part of everyday speech, and his wealth surpassed what Carson himself had ever dreamed of. But when it came to Carson, the man whose approval could crown legends, Jerry Seinfeld was met not with warmth, but with a cold silence. Why would Johnny Carson, a man celebrated for his generosity toward comedians, harbor such disdain for one of the most successful performers of all time? Was it professional rivalry, a clash of generations, or something darker that revealed more about Seinfeld than anyone dared to say out loud? The answer is more complicated than a simple grudge. It cuts to the heart of who Carson was, who Seinfeld became, and what comedy itself means in American culture. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on one of Hollywood's most fascinating unspoken feuds: the Cold War between television's kingmaker and the man who made a fortune convincing us that nothing was funny enough to talk about. By the end of this story, you'll understand why Carson never gave Seinfeld the most precious gift he could bestow: his blessing, and why that omission matters more than any paycheck or ratings victory. Because in the world of comedy, being funny is one thing, being respected is another. And for Johnny Carson, respect was everything. It was 1993, and Jerry Seinfeld stood at the very summit of his career. His sitcom, Seinfeld, was the cultural juggernaut of NBC's must-see TV lineup, drawing tens of millions of viewers every Thursday night. At 38 years old, he was hailed as a genius of observational humor, a man who had transformed trivial musings into television gold. He had fame, fortune, and the adoration of the public. But in Central Park one spring afternoon, Seinfeld made a decision that would shadow him for years to come, and forever alter Johnny Carson's perception of him. That was the year he began dating Shoshana Lonstein, a student at New York's elite Dalton School, just 17 years old at the time. What began as a chance meeting quickly evolved into a relationship that drew headlines and raised eyebrows across America. Seinfeld insisted that nothing romantic happened until she turned 18. But photographs told a different story. Images of the middle-aged comic and his teenage companion in intimate settings splashed across tabloids. For a nation that had grown up watching him joke about parking spaces and airline food, the sight was jarring. For Johnny Carson, it was intolerable. Carson was a man of old-school sensibilities. He had built his reputation as an entertainer families could trust, someone who represented discretion, polish, and a certain Midwestern sense of propriety. A 38-year-old celebrity publicly dating a high schooler was, in his view, beyond the pale. According to former Tonight Show staff, Johnny quietly but firmly drew a line. When a writer pitched a monologue joke referencing Seinfeld's relationship, Carson cut it immediately. "We're not going there," he said, instructing his team to avoid the subject altogether. To him, the mere association was distasteful. Mainstream media couldn't ignore it. People magazine ran a cover story pointedly titled "The Graduate," while Newsweek called the relationship unsavory and questioned what a man of Seinfeld's stature saw in someone barely out of adolescence. The couple stayed together for 4 years, but the damage to Jerry's image, especially among industry veterans like Carson, was lasting. In Johnny's world, where entertainers were expected to uphold a certain dignity, Seinfeld had crossed an unspoken boundary. Years later, when asked about Jerry, Carson remarked, "Some comedians understand that with great success comes great responsibility. Others just understand success." The implication was clear. Jerry had failed a test Johnny never forgave. Behind the bright lights and the laughter, the true measure of a performer often reveals itself not in front of the cameras, but behind them. Johnny Carson, despite being one of the most famous men in America, had a reputation for humility with those who worked around him. Stagehands, assistants, cameramen. He learned their names, asked about their families, and treated them with the respect of equals. To Carson, show business was a collaborative effort. Every joke told, every laugh earned, depended on the unseen hundreds who made The Tonight Show possible. Jerry Seinfeld's reputation was the opposite. Those who worked with him described a man who was unfailingly professional, always on time, always prepared, but distant. It was like there was an invisible wall between Jerry and everyone else, recalled one Tonight Show crew member. He wasn't rude, but neither was he warm. Where Carson would linger after a rehearsal to thank the stage manager, Seinfeld would vanish to his dressing room. Where Johnny might laugh with the band or banter with the writers, Jerry kept to himself, clinical and detached. Carson noticed. He had spent decades surrounded by comedians of all kinds. Volatile geniuses like Robin Williams, sharp wordsmiths like David Letterman, even difficult personalities like Joan Rivers. But what he valued above all was authenticity and humility. He believed that the best comedians were not only funny, but also human. They could laugh at themselves, connect with others, and carry their success lightly. Jerry, in Carson's eyes, lacked that quality. The contrast became painfully clear during one comedy roundtable. Seinfeld, with his trademark smirk, dismissed several peers, including Carson favorites like Letterman and Jay Leno, as men who tried too hard to please audiences. The audience laughed, but backstage, the silence was heavy. Carson's smile was thin, his disapproval obvious. Johnny hated that kind of talk, remembered a writer. For a man who had built his empire on collegiality, dismissing fellow comedians wasn't confidence. It was insecurity. Gary Shandling, another comic of the era, later explained Carson's philosophy. "Johnny once told me the mark of a great comedian is whether other comedians want to be around them." By that measure, Seinfeld failed. He was respected, certainly, but rarely beloved. For Carson, who believed comedy was a communal art, Seinfeld's aloofness wasn't just a personality quirk. It was a flaw that cut to the heart of his character. Johnny Carson quietly became one of the richest entertainers in television history. By the 1980s, he was NBC's most valuable asset, commanding salaries that dwarfed those of movie stars. Yet Carson wore his success lightly. He drove nice cars and owned elegant homes, but he rarely flaunted them. His generosity was discreet, his lifestyle understated. To those who knew him, Johnny's Midwestern upbringing in Nebraska never left him. He believed a performer should connect with ordinary people, not separate himself with displays of excess. As one longtime producer recalled, Johnny had everything, but he never rubbed it in anyone's face. He thought bragging about money was tacky. Jerry Seinfeld embodied the opposite approach. After Seinfeld ended in 1998, his fortune exploded thanks to syndication deals worth over $100 million a year. Rather than downplay his riches, Jerry leaned into them. He became synonymous with luxury, a private jet lifestyle, interviews where he discussed his income, and most famously, his legendary collection of more than 100 Porsches. Entire shows, like Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, were built around his gleaming vehicles, an aesthetic that celebrated abundance rather than modesty. To Carson, this was more than a generational difference. It was a sign of disconnect. "You don't get funnier when your garage gets bigger," Johnny once remarked to a staff member. For him, comedy grew from struggle, observation, and the shared experiences of everyday life. Flaunting wealth risked alienating the very people who made you successful, the audience. Carson came of age during the Great Depression. Money was important, but humility mattered more. In his world, the comedian was supposed to be the everyman, the mirror to the audience, not a billionaire on a pedestal. Seinfeld, however, represented a new breed of celebrity. For younger fans, his lifestyle was aspirational, proof that comedy could buy not only laughs, but also status. But for Carson, who saw comedy as a unifying force, Jerry's public celebration of wealth was distasteful. The gap between them grew wider. One man grounded in Midwestern sensibility, the other basking in a brand built on luxury. It wasn't just about cars or money. It was about what comedy meant. For Johnny Carson, wealth was a private matter. For Jerry Seinfeld, it was part of the act. And that difference spoke volumes. For 3 decades, Johnny Carson perfected a format that became the very definition of late-night television. The monologue, the desk, the couch, the effortless banter with celebrities, The Tonight Show. Starring Johnny Carson wasn't just a program. It was America's nightly conversation. Politicians, movie stars, and comedians all passed through Carson's stage, knowing that a smile from him could mean credibility with the entire nation. To Johnny, this format wasn't formulaic. It was an art form, a ritual that bonded Americans across generations. Jerry Seinfeld saw it differently. By the time he launched Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee in 2012, he was no longer simply a sitcom star, but a cultural figure in his own right. Promoting the series, Jerry repeatedly contrasted his stripped-down concept, 2 comedians chatting in expensive cars over coffee, with what he dismissed as the tired conventions of the talk show. "I don't want to interview actors about movies I haven't seen," he told one interviewer. "I'm not interested in fake enthusiasm or pretend interest. This is the only show worth doing. It's real." For industry insiders, the subtext was unmistakable. Seinfeld was positioning his show as a rejection of the very talk show format Carson had created. To Johnny, even in retirement, this stung. Here was a guy whose entire career began with The Tonight Show stage. Dismissing the format as phony, said a longtime NBC executive. Carson had been famously sensitive about his legacy, and Seinfeld's remarks cut deep. Friends later revealed that Johnny felt Jerry's attitude was not only ungrateful, but also dismissive of the thousands of people who had built their lives around the late-night structure. The irony was rich. Jerry Seinfeld's first big national break had come precisely because of Carson. Like countless comics of his generation, his appearances on The Tonight Show had introduced him to a national audience. Without the couch, without the monologue, Seinfeld might have remained just another comic hustling in New York clubs. To then dismiss the entire format as outdated struck Carson as both ungracious and disrespectful. For Carson, the talk show was more than entertainment. It was America's town square, a nightly check-in that carried the nation through assassinations, wars, scandals, and triumphs. To hear it described as irrelevant was to hear his life's work diminished. In Carson's world, comedy connected America. In Seinfeld's, it was a private brand, and the gulf between those visions could not have been wider. Johnny Carson believed that the greatest comedians did more than make people laugh. They made them feel. Over 3 decades on The Tonight Show, he welcomed performers who revealed their struggles, their flaws, and their humanity. Richard Pryor bared his battles with addiction and race. George Carlin dismantled social norms with biting commentary. Robin Williams danced on the edge of madness and brilliance, his manic energy betraying the pain beneath. These were comedians who, in Carson's view, transcended jokes. They illuminated the human condition. Jerry Seinfeld represented the opposite philosophy. He was the master of observational comedy, dissecting parking spaces, airline peanuts, and everyday trivialities with unmatched precision. But he proudly declared his disinterest in deeper material. "I'm not interested in feelings," Seinfeld once said in an interview. "I'm interested in funny." For Carson, this was comedy stripped of its soul, technically flawless, but emotionally hollow. The laughter was real, but the connection was missing. Carson, who had endured public divorces, the death of a son, and his own struggles with alcohol, believed comedy was a form of catharsis. It wasn't only about escaping life's difficulties, but about transforming them into something universal. "Great comedy makes you laugh, but it should also make you recognize yourself," explained a longtime Carson confidant. To Johnny, Seinfeld's refusal to touch pain, politics, or vulnerability left his work one-dimensional. Brilliant, yes, but shallow. The difference became evident whenever Seinfeld sat on Carson's couch. Johnny would probe gently, hoping for something more personal, something that hinted at the man behind the jokes. Jerry, guarded as ever, kept the wall intact. He delivered quips, but not confessions. He made people laugh, but never allowed them to see inside. To Carson, that separation wasn't strength, it was avoidance. Years later, when asked to compare comedians, Carson once remarked, "Some make you laugh until you cry. Others make you laugh until you think. The great ones do both." It was a philosophy that celebrated vulnerability as much as timing. Seinfeld, in Carson's estimation, chose the easy path. Jokes without depth, humor without heart. For a man like Johnny, who valued comedy as a bridge to shared humanity, that choice was the ultimate disappointment. By the twilight of his career, Johnny Carson rarely spoke publicly about comedy. After his retirement in 1992, he withdrew almost entirely from the spotlight, granting only a handful of interviews. Yet among the few subjects that could draw him out, one stood apart: Norm Macdonald. "He's the only one who reminds me of myself," Carson reportedly told close friends. For a man as careful with praise as Johnny, it was the highest possible compliment. Carson saw in Norm something that reminded him of comedy's golden lineage: dry, deliberate, fearless. Macdonald was unafraid to bomb if it meant staying true to his peculiar voice. He carried himself with the same understated modesty Johnny valued, never pandering, never chasing approval. To Carson, Norm represented continuity with the comedians he had admired in his own youth: Jack Benny, George Burns, Bob Hope. Like them, MacDonald understood that silence could be as powerful as a punchline, and that honesty mattered more than polish. The contrast with Jerry Seinfeld was striking. Where Seinfeld built a brand around wealth and perfection, Norm embodied humility and risk. When Seinfeld appeared on Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, his conversation with Norm was revealing. Jerry, measured and controlled. Norm, meandering and raw. For Carson, this difference said everything. Comedy, in his mind, wasn't about being flawless. It was about being fearless. When MacDonald passed away in September 2021 after a private 9-year battle with cancer, tributes poured in from across the comedy world. David Letterman, Conan O'Brien, Adam Sandler, and countless others paid their respects. But one voice was conspicuously absent. Jerry Seinfeld's. Not even a tweet. Not a single public acknowledgement. For many, this silence reinforced an image that had long clung to Jerry. That of a comedian brilliant in craft, but lacking in generosity of spirit. Carson's former producer put it bluntly. Johnny always said you could judge a comedian's character by how they talk about other comedians. By that measure, Jerry failed. For those still loyal to Carson's values, Seinfeld's silence about Norm's death was not just an oversight. It was a confirmation. It showed that the qualities Johnny had once admired, humility, respect, connection, were absent in the man who had built a fortune on jokes about nothing. Norm Macdonald, not Jerry Seinfeld, carried Carson's torch. And in the eyes of the king of late night, that distinction meant everything. The feud between Johnny Carson and Jerry Seinfeld was never shouted from rooftops, never splashed across tabloids with fiery headlines. It was quieter than that. Subtle glances, withheld praise, the absence of an invitation that mattered more than money. Yet in its silence, it spoke volumes. What separated the two men was not merely a generational gap, but a philosophical chasm about what comedy is meant to be. Carson came from an era when laughter was a bridge. His show wasn't just entertainment. It was America's nightly gathering, a space where humility and humanity were as important as punchlines. He believed the greatest comedians shared themselves, their flaws, their sorrows, their truths, so audiences felt less alone. Seinfeld, by contrast, perfected a comedy of detachment, witty, polished, but insulated from pain or vulnerability. Where Carson saw comedy as service, Jerry saw it as brand. Both men were titans. Carson ruled late night for 30 years, becoming the most trusted man in America. Seinfeld created one of the most successful sitcoms in history and amassed a fortune beyond imagination. But for all his wealth and influence, Jerry never received what countless lesser-known comedians did: Johnny Carson's blessing. That single omission lingers like a shadow over his otherwise unblemished legacy. Perhaps Carson himself said it best. There are comedians who make you laugh until you cry. And then there are comedians who make you laugh until you think. The great ones do both. I'm still waiting for Jerry to make me think. It was a verdict that crystallized not just his feelings toward Seinfeld, but his philosophy of comedy itself. To Johnny, wit without depth was like wealth without humility. Impressive, but incomplete. And so we're left with a question that reaches beyond two men and their feud. Which kind of comedy truly endures? The warm, connective humor of Carson's era, or the cool, detached irony of Seinfeld's? The answer may depend on what we seek when we laugh, escape, or understanding. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Hollywood's most fascinating unspoken rivalries, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. Whose approach resonates more with you, Carson's or Seinfeld's? And tell us which hidden Hollywood stories you'd like us to explore next. Because sometimes, the greatest dramas in entertainment aren't found on stage, but in the shadows just beyond the spotlight.